Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Taylor, and I'm from Oregon, which is in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States, where I grew up on my grandmother's hops farm, as when I was about 8 years old, both my parents were tragically killed when a drunk truck driver ploughed into my parents' car, killing them on impact in a head-on collision that literally was to shatter my life into hundreds of pieces, but much was done on my grandmother's part to glue those pieces together again, which she did with masterful precision. My grandmother at the time, who'd been recently widowed, recalled the day with crystal clear clarity, because she had sensed earlier on in the afternoon, with a powerful intuition and almost psychic discernment, that something quite terrible or catastrophic was about to happen later on that night. I don't know how to describe the intimidating feeling, she told me, but I did have an overwhelming sense of impending doom and dread that hung over me the entire day like a dark, menacing, ominous thundercloud. It was as real as perceiving that there might be rain in the evening, because you can almost smell and feel it in the air. You know it's coming, and it usually does. That was how this perception was for me. But it wasn't pleasant, and my stomach was twisted into knots, and I was unable to eat all day. Later in the evening, when the phone rang, I just knew that your mother was dead. I remember answering the phone and saying, "When did it happen?" And the voice on the other end of the phone sounded heartily relieved, as they assumed that someone else had informed me about your mother's death. So they were very shocked that I just knew she had died, but not in the manner of how it had actually transpired or come about. "But how could you know, Granny?" I asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "Maybe it's a bond between a mother and daughter, who knows? But I just knew she was gone." You would think that my grandmother would be filled with resentment and rage, given that the drunk driver had killed her only beloved daughter and her precious son-in-law. But my grandmother was so filled with compassion and forgiveness for the young man who had accidentally killed her loved ones, because she believed emphatically that behind every story was another story, and that nothing ever was just black or white or plain sailing. I remember she shocked many of our relatives by insisting on visiting the truck driver in prison, and had subsequently learnt that he had a sad story of his own to relate. For 6 long years spent as a long-haul truck driver, he had worked tirelessly hauling freights of cargo all over North America, doing a job he hated and despised in order to provide for his wife and the children that they both intended to have together in the future. In a trice, his dreams were soon to be crushed and smashed to smithereens, and there was no hope on the horizon that was promising enough to repair the damage. I understood that his wife was his childhood sweetheart, and he would have walked the ends of the earth for her, as he loved and adored her so much. One day he decided to surprise his wife for their anniversary, and armed with a huge bouquet of red roses and a bottle of the finest French champagne, he had returned home early in the evening and crept stealthily into the house, using the spare key. He tiptoed quietly up the stairs towards the bedroom door. He paused for a moment, standing very still, and smiled as he heard his pretty wife's musical laugh. Then after a moment he heard the deep sound of a man's voice, and he quickly froze to the spot and peeked through the crack of the bedroom door. He could see his wife's physical shape buried beneath a duvet cover, locked in another man's arms, and he could see a trail of the remnants of their clothing lying across the floor in heaps. He had seen enough, too much for his eyes to bear, too much to comprehend about what had transpired between the two of them, for his imagination did not want to engage in such pollutant graphic imagery, for it was as raw as a huge blow to the lower guts. In that moment it was like his world came crumbling down, as the reality of what had transpired hit him hard like a bucket of ice-cold water being flung over his head, and the beauty of his once pristine, almost perfect relationship was completely soiled and tarnished like red wine on a meticulous cream carpet. Despite the brutal unkindness of what he had just witnessed, he reacted with composure and dignity, and quietly turned around and cautiously slipped out of the house, making sure not to be seen by his cheating wife. In this moment he described to my grandmother that he felt as if his wife had torn out his heart and ripped it into pieces, and in seconds his dreams, hopes, and aspirations for their future together blew up in a whiff of smoke. This devastated, broken man slunk into the seat of his truck, and his head flung forward upon the steering wheel, and the waterworks in his eyes burst open, and the tears spilled down his cheeks, and he realized in horror and shame that he was crying. And through the misty sea of his salty tears, he made his way to an all-night bar, and began to drink like he'd never ever drunk before. Soon the pain of his thoughts were numbed and anaesthetized. Eventually, hardly being able to stand up straight, he had staggered out of the bar, so plastered that in his drunken stupor he had climbed back into his truck. Someone had knocked on his window. "Bro, should you be driving? How about I give you a lift home? You look like you're in no state to drive." He had ignored that kindly, wizened voice and started up the engine, driving through the wet streets that were now quiet without a soul in sight, for it would seem even the dusky night was crying for this troubled man's tormented, bedraggled soul. Thunder boomed and crashed, and lightning flashed across the sky in a resplendent display of jagged fireworks, and the heavens opened, and the rain began to pour down in buckets. He vaguely remembers the efficient windscreen wipers working vigorously to brush away the sorrowful, heavy tears of Mother Earth, but after that he barely recalls what transpired next. He thinks he may have blacked out for a moment, but indeed that is all it takes for his whole life to be irrevocably shaken apart and turned upside down, for it only takes a single second for things that are done to never be undone. In that appalling, loathsome moment, he had plunged his truck into my mother and father, and he felt the violent smash of the devastating and tragic impact as my parents' car somersaulted into the air and came thundering and crashing violently to the ground, buckling before his very eyes into a tiny congealed heap. And he describes the car folding, bending and curling as easily as a crushed Coke can in your hands. In a trice, through the falling raindrops on his windscreen, he discerned yellow, red and blue lights flashing from ambulances, police and fire brigade, and the jaws of life were being employed to open a car that was so crushed up it resembled a tight, clammed-up mussel shell. Then he heard the toxic, terrifying words that nobody wants to hear from the fire chief: "All lives extinct." And after that, he completely blacked out, only to discover himself locked up in a police cell the following morning. My grandmother regularly went to visit Peter Berger, well, that was his name, during his incarceration, and they became firm friends. And thanks to my grandmother's persuasive, positive influence over the judge, he served a short prison sentence. "You are a lucky man, Peter Berger," the judge had said. "Make sure you make a fresh start to your life." Yet despite everything, Peter was a broken man, riddled with guilt over having killed 2 young people, and very aggrieved over the irredeemable state of his crumbled, ruptured marriage that had tragically ended in divorce, and his wife was none the wiser as to why he wanted to call it quits on their marriage. My mother described Peter Berger as like a bird with a broken wing that had lost all hope and faith in his life, and on several occasions he had tried to hang himself in moments when the gravity of what he had done weighed so heavily upon his soul. My grandmother said to him, "Peter, you need to forgive yourself for what happened, for we have all done things in this life we regret. Please don't let this accident define you. Don't let it take your life as it has taken my daughter and son-in-law. If it takes you as well, then it will really be a travesty. It'll be like a mother eagle who has 3 young eaglets in her nest, but times are lean, and the birds are fighting to survive. But 2 must perish, for nature can be hard and cruel. How much more devastated will the mother eagle be if the final last bird gives up and dies? You are that last final bird, Peter, so please don't give up." My grandmother had taken Peter under her wing, treating him like a son, as she refused to see another life ruined by that tragic accident, and she gave Peter the role as farm manager on our farm to take over from my grandfather. Peter moved into the spare room in our farmhouse, and he took to farming like a duck to water and was loving his job, as it would seem he found his true calling in life. Before long he had fallen in love with a local girl called Sandy, and they occupied the 3rd floor of our large colonial farmhouse, and we lived together as one big happy family, as weird as the set-up may actually sound, but we were all very happy together, and we loved each other very much, and we may as well have been related by blood, for so strong were the bonds between us all. Growing up as a young boy, I just loved the wide open spaces of the farm, the verdant countryside, the silvery lakes, the flowery meadows, the ubiquitous areas of natural woodland. One day Peter and I decided to go rabbit hunting together, because the rabbits were breeding abundantly on our land and becoming a potential problem and hazard for the crops. It was in early spring, and we tended to find that they were hopping around the edges of our farmland in areas of sagebrush or among the Himalayan blackberry or snowberry bushes, as they liked hiding in dense cover. We knew we needed to take them down to manage their ever-increasing numbers, so with our shotguns we had managed to kill several dozen rabbits, but we left them on the ground with the intention of gathering up their bodies after the hunt, as my grandmother and Sandy were planning to make delicious rabbit pies, which in my opinion taste exactly like chicken. We felt quite pleased with our achievements, and I have to admit the shoot had been exhilarating, and I think Peter and I were quite pleased with our accomplishments, as a good hunt is indeed a gratifying experience, as any hunter will tell you. "Well done, boy," said Peter, slapping me on the back enthusiastically. "You were an excellent shot. You should be proud of yourself, boy." I grinned happily to myself, lapping up the praise like a thirsty dog, but when we went to gather up our trophies, they had all but vanished. Peter looked at me with an agog expression on his face. "Where are all the dead rabbits?" he said. "Where the heck did they go to? Is someone having a laugh or a joke at our expense?" Peter and I looked around the immediate area and began to conduct a search for the missing dead rabbits. This was our land, and it was unlikely that my grandmother or Sandy would be playing tricks on us, so where in the world had the dead rabbits got to? To say that we were completely bewildered and astonished is an understatement, as this was a mystery of note, or an enigmatic situation that we were most determined to resolve, come what may. All of a sudden, Peter and I could hear what I can only describe as raised high-pitched voices that sounded like someone was having an argument. Peter indicated for me to follow him, and we stealthily and cautiously crept through the wood-green that consisted of statuesque white oak trees, flowering pink dogwoods and maple trees that were scattered with a scant display of either orange or yellow blossoms. We tiptoed towards the sounds, darting from one tree to another like American soldiers in military pursuit of an enemy target that we wished to ambush, and for a moment I felt as if I was in a real wartime situation, and I felt inflated by this incredible feeling of importance and pride, as silly as that may sound. I think Peter and I secretly discerned that the voices that we had both heard belonged to the stranger who'd stolen our rabbits, and it would seem we were not wrong about this. But the stranger was not what either of us would have ever have imagined or anticipated in our wildest dreams or biggest imaginings. For there, standing upright on 2 feet, larger than life, was a colossal female Bigfoot and her youngling. I knew at once that these creatures were Bigfoots, because there's been more than enough television documentaries about these creatures, such as Finding Bigfoot and other series like that over the years. While I had thought that such documentaries were exciting and interesting, and that there was a probability that these creatures could in fact be real, never in my wildest dreams did I anticipate or envisage an encounter of my very own. I glanced briefly at Peter to see the expression upon his face, and he was transfixed by amazement, so much so that his eyes had grown like saucers, and his mouth was hanging open like a Venus flytrap, ready to swallow a fly. The youngling was clearly being reprimanded severely by the female, for she was yapping incessantly at him, without even stopping to draw breath, and the language she spoke sounded like a high-pitched form of Mandarin or Chinese. The little critter must have been carrying 15 of our dead rabbits in one overlong arm, and 15 in another, and for some reason the female Bigfoot did not seem impressed with her son, who was avoiding eye contact with her and hanging his head in low in shame, as if he knew he was in an awful lot of trouble. If you've ever wondered if Bigfoots have ears, I can assure you they most certainly do. As a mother grabbed her youngling's ear from beneath the layers of long flowing auburn hair from his pyramid-shaped head, and yanked it very hard, and the poor little critter let out a pained cry, almost like an ouch, but it was more like "Ooh! Ooh!" The female then took about 5 of the rabbits from the critter and began pointing towards the sagebrush, and that was when I realised exactly what was going on. The female Bigfoot had told her son to collect a couple of dead rabbits from our chute, so we would possibly not even notice that any were missing. But her youngling had collected all our trophies, and the female Bigfoot was telling him to go and put them right back where he'd found them. I couldn't believe how privileged I was to observe the scene unfold before my very eyes, and the behaviour that they exuded was so human, like it really suppressed any feelings of fear on my part, that I possibly should have felt, for indeed these creatures were exceedingly intimidating. I could sense the Bigfoots were very intelligent, but they were also impressive in stature, girth, and weight. At a guess, I would say the female was possibly 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, whilst her youngling was about 4 foot tall and 200 pounds. They both were covered in auburn hair, but only the younger's was a lighter colour than hers was, and they both possessed those typical pyramid-shaped heads and very human faces with deep-set eyes, sloped foreheads, and flattened noses. We watched the female shake her head in despair, much like any mother who is exasperated with her kid would do, and we watched her gliding away into the heart of the woods, disappearing from our sight. I must say I could hardly believe what we had seen. If that isn't weird enough for you, I kid you not when I say that the little Bigfoot had replaced our dead rabbits in the identical places where the rabbits had been shot, so his sense of recall was absolutely astonishing. In fact, it blew my mind. I did remember a couple of places where we had shot a rabbit that had not been replaced, and instead of the dead rabbit was a white riverstone, which I would most certainly have overlooked in most circumstances, but on this occasion I knew that they had not previously been there. In every location where there was a missing rabbit was a riverstone, almost like some form of currency for our dead rabbit, and I was secretly rather impressed. As you can imagine, Peter and I couldn't wait to get back to Sandra and my grandmother to tell them what we'd seen, and we were surprised they believed our outlandish story, but they did. They were excited to learn that we had Bigfoots on our land, and were hoping for an encounter all of their own. The following year, Peter and I embarked on the rabbit hunt all over again. It was our only efficient measure of ensuring that we managed the ever-increasing rabbit population. On this occasion we were much more alert to our environment, and both sensed we were being studied by unseen eyes, scrutinising our every move. But we perceived that those eyes clearly belonged to Bigfoot's, and this secret knowledge did excite us, as we were both on tender hooks, hoping for another encounter with this elusive, mysterious, hairy humanoid. I gathered all the dead rabbits together into a sizable pile, and placed them next to the thorny bush of briars. I made a mental note of how many we had killed, and kept glancing stealthily back towards the pile to see if I could see the dark, shadowy figure of a Bigfoot sneaking up to steal a few. But that is not what I saw. Instead, I could see a large bush of thorny briars twitching and moving slightly, which was something I would never normally have discerned. And then I witnessed this overlong, hairy arm reaching out through the spiky thorns towards the pile of rabbits, and skillfully pinching one rabbit, and then another and another. I'm pretty certain a Bigfoot was hidden under the bush, lying flat on his stomach on the ground, and sneakily pulling away one rabbit at a time. I assure you it would be impossible for a human to do this under a hedge of thorns without being shredded to pieces. I think another Bigfoot had been watching the proceedings and had probably noticed that I had observed the hairy arm, and it retracted very suddenly after a warning whistle was sounded that was possibly meant to sound like a bird, but it was too shrill for that, and it wasn't fooling anyone. I pretended to be focusing on the shooting, but I was secretly looking at the hedgerow, and I could see it moving again, as the Bigfoot that had been hiding there was cleverly wiggling out of the bush, and then in a fleeting second I saw him gliding towards the woods with 3 rabbits in his hands and glancing briefly in my direction. In that second our eyes met. I whistled to the critter, and it stopped for a second and studied me through deep-set dark eyes. I threw 3 more dead rabbits towards him, and he picked them up very quickly and nodded at me, as if to say thanks, and then he vanished from my sight. The critter I saw was possibly the 4-foot critter that I'd seen a year earlier, but now he was easily over 6 foot tall. The following morning, I kid you not, there were 6 white river stones on our front doorstep that I knew were from the Bigfoot. Every year after that, whenever Peter and I engaged in the rabbit hunt, I would whistle and put out several rabbits, and they would disappear. And we have done that ever since, and for every rabbit we are always rewarded with river stones. On the subject of Peter, who has always been like a father to me, I am glad to say that he no longer is strangled and choked by the incessant guilt of what happened to my parents all those years ago, and he has managed to forgive himself for the accident. I'm glad to say his wife Sandy gave birth to 2 children, who I regard as my sisters, and in truth I could never envisage my life without the 4 of them. One day when I was about 15 years old, I decided to make some potato chips, and I wasn't the best cook, and simply forgot about the chip pan with the hot oil on the stove, which is a very dangerous and irresponsible thing of me to have done. All of a sudden I smelt the smoke, and ran into the kitchen in a blind panic, horrified to see huge vertical flames from the chip pan rising up to the ceiling. I ran forward, trying to stop the inferno, and the flames bounced from the pan onto my whole body, and in a second I was engulfed in flames. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. I remember feeling pure panic. My eyes were watering, it was smoky, and the flames began to sting my skin. I began to scream for help, help, help! And Peter came rushing into the kitchen, grabbing me into his arms and dashing into the yard, flinging me into the swimming pool. So he saved my life that day. Of that I am certain. If Peter's response towards me had not been so prompt and efficient, I am quite certain I would have had 3rd-degree burns. So although Peter had accidentally taken my parents' life on that fateful day many long years ago, he intentionally saved mine without any regard for his own safety, so he most certainly redeemed himself. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Michelle Nightingale, and I've worked with the dying in the Pacific Northwest here in America for over the last 20 years, and they have taught me so much about the value of life and how brief our time actually is on this earth. And if I've learnt anything from the dying, It is that we need to appreciate every single day, because we don't know when it might be our last. For there is little doubt that our life under the sun is very short and fleeting, and the same fate ultimately awaits us all, whether rich or poor, fat or thin, clever or dim. It's a privilege spending the last few days, weeks, or even months with the dying, and in my experience there are moments when my patients need to talk, and sometimes they've shared things with me that no one else is privy to knowing about. Sometimes it might be expressing regret about wishing they'd spent more time with loved ones and less time working, or wishing that they had pursued their passions instead of doing jobs that they invariably hated, or most surprisingly of all, wishing that they hadn't wasted so much of their life living in fear or trepidation. I've never actually heard of a dying person expressing regret about not making enough money, for in the end of life, relationships with loved ones are the most precious treasures to a dying person. The story I'm going to share with you happened when I was given a job of taking care of an elderly lady, who was a very fussy particular person, who had actually turfed out 5 nurses who had been taking care of her because she hadn't warmed to any of them. I remember thinking to myself that this woman was going to be one of those cantankerous, disagreeable, belligerent people who might just throw her porridge oats at me in the morning or create a huge tantrum when I tried to give her her medication. Believe me, I've had difficult, tumultuous, disagreeable and taxing patients like that before, more than a little determined to give me a grievously hard time and making my life as difficult as possible. So on this occasion I felt very uncertain about the job at hand, and whether I'd end up being nurse number 6, thrown to the wayside or curb if you like a discarded piece of trash, like all my predecessors before me. I had the sinking feeling that this would indeed be my likely fate. The woman lived in a very charming whitewashed double-storey cottage made out of bricks and mortar, with large sash windows and rambling pink and yellow climbing roses intermingled with purple wisteria that covered the wall around the front door. The panoramic views surrounding this whimsical dreamy cottage were terribly pretty, with spectacularly lush verdant countryside, where you could see horses from the neighbouring farm grazing on the open pastures. The woman's backyard was scattered liberally with apple trees and was separated by a sizable wooden pole fence, so the neighbours' horses could trot over and rest their large heads over the pole, and you could feed them apples and stroke their silky manes, so it was almost as if the farmland that surrounded her property was an extension of her own home, and you could be forgiven for assuming that the horses actually belonged to her. After parking my car on the grassy verge, I opened the white wicker gate, which squeaked, and I walked down the cobbled path to the front door, where I banged the golden horseshoe knocker a couple of times. I began to tremble with trepidation as I straightened the collar of my blue nurse's uniform very awkwardly, my fingers shaking somewhat. I wasn't sure what manner of reception to actually expect. All of a sudden the door was flung open by a tall man with silvery hair, whom I realised must be the woman's son. He was easily in his late 60s. He greeted me with a sombre, serious expression upon his face and invited me into the cosy study, where there were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with impressive, old-looking books. He invited me to sit on a very smart upholstered chair on the opposite side of his gleaming mahogany desk, which made me feel as if I was in a doctor's office waiting for my script or an impending diagnosis of sorts. "I'm sure you've heard that my mother has turned away 5 nurses already," he said to me, shuffling awkwardly in his chair. "I'm afraid she's a very difficult woman with particular tastes. I'm hoping you're not going to be nurse number 6, he said, looking at me through his spectacles with beady eyes. "I'm hoping that too, sir," I said. "I'll do my best to appease her." "That's what I like to hear," said the man. "You've got the right attitude. You mustn't be intimidated by my mother, because her bark is worse than her bite." "How long has she got, sir?" I asked. "Possibly 6 months or so," he said to me. "The bladder cancer is very aggressive, I'm afraid." Before long I was ushered into the woman's bedroom, where I could see a sweet little old lady sitting up in a large bed, with puffed-up pillows, and there was nothing about her warm countenance that gave me the impression that she was a disagreeable person. The sunshine from the open windows enveloped the room in a soft light, and a gentle breeze blew the curtains to the left and right, and they swung as they moved in the wind, backwards and forwards. "Mother, this is Michelle Nightingale, and she's the new nurse I told you about. I hope you're not going to give her too much of a hard time, like you did all the others." The woman glanced at me with warm, amused brown eyes and said, "That depends, son, on whether I like her or not. But with a surname like Nightingale, the future's already looking a lot more promising," she said, giving me a big wink. In that moment I felt an incredible connection with this lovely lady, and so began a 6 months relationship of the likes that I shall never ever forget. For Dorothy Perkins was a woman with a sparkling personality the size of Washington State, and a heart of solid gold. But she was the kind of person not afraid to speak her mind, and she loathed nothing more than people who viewed her with pity because of her terminal diagnosis, as like most dying people, she wanted to be treated like an adult and not like a baby. Even though Dorothy was dying and she had her moments of weakness and pain, of which were managed by morphine and medications, there were times she was remarkably coherent, and it was in those moments that I began to learn all about her life growing up on her father's farm in the Pacific Northwest, and I realized at once that this woman had led a full, meaningful, delightful life, and it would seem that she certainly had no regrets. One day Dorothy patted the side of her bed and encouraged me to sit down next to her. "Tell me, Michelle, do you believe in Bigfoot?" she asked me. At that, I was completely caught off my guard. "To be honest," I said, "I'm not really sure. I've not actually given the matter much thought, but I am open-minded enough to believe that there is every possibility that such a creature might just exist here in North America. Of course, I am no expert on these matters." "Good," said Dorothy. "I like your honesty, and the fact that you're not trying to humour me, just because I'm a dying person." "Why would I do that?" I said, looking appalled. "That would be tantamount to belittling you and treating you like a baby, and that would be ridiculous. Now you know why I had no time for all the nurses before you, because they were so over-nice and would tell me exactly what I wanted to hear. But what I like about you, Michelle, is you're real and authentic, and you don't pretend to be something you're not." "Now I'm going to tell you a dying woman's deep, dark secret," she said, giggling. "In truth, I never thought I would share this story with anyone, but for some reason I want to share it with you." And this was the story Dorothy told me in her very own words. "I grew up on a sheep farm here in the Pacific Northwest, where I lived with my parents, in a very large farmhouse with barns, ponds, acres of land, sagebrush, flowery meadows, and a large wood green that stretched back for many miles. My father was a diligent farmer, and he took care of those sheep of his superbly. I loved helping him on the farm, and there were times when he put me in charge of young orphaned lambs to raise on bottled milk, and those were fun-filled times indeed, because there is nothing cuter than feeding a baby lamb bottled milk. I can assure you of that. One day my mother and her sister Pamela were going away for a few days to stay at the Oregon coast. They were going to be attending a very large, exciting fair in the area, which included a travelling circus and some kind of a food festival and farmers' competition, where farmers from all over the Pacific Northwest came together to compete with who could grow the biggest pumpkins, squashes, cucumbers and stuff like that. And in those days there was a real community spirit, and everybody wanted to be a winner. Farmers from everywhere were using every trick in the book to try and grow their vegetables larger than the next man. My mother and her aunt were entering their preserves and shortbread biscuits in a competition for the food show. I remember my mother was exceedingly confident about winning first prize for her strawberry jam, which was quite literally the best jam you've ever tasted. At the time I had a little cousin called George, and he was about 5 years old, and a very mischievous child, and my aunt put me in charge of him. I remember her saying to me, "Dorothy, you're 14 years old now, and I'm going to trust you to take care of your little cousin, and you must promise me to watch over him very diligently while your mother and I are away for a few days. Your father is very busy minding those sheep of his, so I'm depending on you to look after him very carefully. I think you've grown up into a responsible girl, and I feel sure that I can entrust you with such a big responsibility, and I know I shall not be disappointed. I remember feeling ever so proud and important that I had been entrusted to take charge over little George, and my aunt gave me a list of times he was to go to bed, what I was to feed him, what time I was to bath him, and so forth. In truth, I thought it was going to be a doddle looking after my cousin, but he turned out to be quite a rambunctious, disobedient ball of energy, and a huge handful to manage. Even after a few hours of watching over him, I was utterly exhausted. My mother had also insisted that while she was away that I took care of all the household chores and prepared all the meals. I had never been endowed with so much responsibility before, and I was ever so slightly overwhelmed. Your father is minding the sheep all day, so you need to feed him up well, she had informed me. Luckily, I was a proficient cook at the time, having acquired all my culinary skills from my mother, and so cooking those meals was not too daunting for me, but looking after my nephew invariably was. I think it must have been about the middle of August, and there was a great deal of huckleberry patches growing on the edges of our meadows, and armed with buckets I persuaded George to come picking with me, which he did with ardent enthusiasm, but his tiny little fingers and mouth became stained with the purple juices as he was eating more huckleberries than actually picking them. All of a sudden George became very excited and animated, and began to point, and then he started running towards these western hemlock trees that fringed the meadow, and he began shouting, "Teddy! Teddy! Big, big Teddy!" I remember shouting, "Get back here now, George! George, come back now! Where are you going, George? Come back!" But George did not listen to me. He just disappeared into the trees. That was when I saw this huge creature that my cousin had mistaken for a teddy bear. But this creature was not a bear, as it had a human face and human-like hands, and was covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair. I was so shocked by what I was perceiving that I literally dropped the large bucket of huckleberries on the ground, carpeting the grass in a sea of berries. The next thing I knew was that my cousin George was riding on the shoulders of this large, anomalous critter, and his face was so jubilant and joyful. He looked like he was chuckling, and I think he thought the bear was going to give him a lovely long ride. In seconds, my little cousin and the creature had vanished into the woods and were gone from my sight. "You mean this creature abducted your cousin?" I asked. "That's exactly what happened," said Dorothy. "Oh, my goodness, what on earth did you do? If it was me, I would have a panic attack on the spot. I mean, how do you react to a situation like that? And you were so young at the time. Who did you call for help?" I never told a single soul about what had happened. I was too scared. I thought I'd get into a whole heap of trouble, especially from my father, if he found out what had happened, and so I acted as if everything was normal. I pretended that George was in bed, and I would stuff a little pillow under the eiderdown so it looked as if my cousin was sleeping, and my father would switch the light off in the bedroom every single night, none the wiser that his nephew was not actually in the bed. I would hear him close the door behind him and say, "Good night, little George, sleep tight." I do not remember a time in my life when I was more overwrought, fearful and apprehensive, and every single day I would get up at the crack of dawn when it was still dark to go searching for my little cousin in the wood green, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I would pray to God, I would beg him to please send my cousin home, or my parents would never forgive me, and my aunt would almost certainly kill me. And if she killed me, I would be joining him very soon, I told him. On the fourth day, when my mother and aunt were about to return, I was seriously beginning to freak out, and I was running around the place like a headless chicken in desperate pursuit of my little cousin. I had no idea what I was going to tell the adults if I couldn't find him. I was thinking up all kinds of over-elaborate melodramatic excuses to tell them. I thought of everything. I was even considering telling them that I'd seen a mountain lion in the woods and that I believed it had surreptitiously pounced on George and grabbed him in its large jaws. You see, I knew if I told them about the incredulous critter that I'd encountered, they would think I was making up fictitious, sensationalistic, embellished stories, and I wanted to be credible and efficacious as far as being a witness is concerned. That day I was running around frantically in the woods when I suddenly heard George's happy chuckles. I could hardly believe it. For a moment I thought my imagination had to be playing tricks on me, but once again I heard George's chuckle, and his little voice saying, "I'm painting you chocolate! I'm painting you chocolate!" And then he began to chuckle. I immediately crept through the woodgrove and saw George playing with a little humanoid creature covered in dark hair, not much bigger than himself, and they were having the time of their lives together. George was standing in this muddy clay-like patch of ground with only his top on, and he was completely naked from the waist down. He looked like he was coated in chocolate from top to bottom. He was using his hands to cover this hairy creature with mud. In turn, the little creature was doing exactly the same to George with his little hands, and they were both completely caked in mud. There was a large creature babysitting the two of them, and she was clearly female, as she had large pillowy breasts, and was covered in long, dark, flowing brown hair. I know now that she was a Bigfoot, but then I didn't know what she was. But her face was so human it was uncanny. I could tell by her delighted expression that she was almost enjoying the mud game as much as the children were, as she kept whooping in delight as she watched them playing, and she was so engaged in their game. It was extraordinary. I don't remember feeling fear, as my primary focus was actually getting George back, as I hadn't seen him in 4 long days. I was literally over the moon to see he was alive and well. I boldly bolted towards my cousin, picking him up in my arms and putting him on my hips. I was standing yards away from the large Bigfoot, and in that moment our eyes met. I do recall her deep-set treacle-coloured eyes were warm and congenial, but she looked surprised to see me. I remember saying to her, "I'm sorry, but my cousin needs to go home right now." The critter, who was sitting down, stood up. She must have been about 8 foot tall. She was huge, and a very large barrel chest, I have to tell you. But I refused to be intimidated by her. I don't think she was standing up to threaten me in any way. It might have just been a gesture of courtesy on her part. I just turned around and walked away, and the critters just watched me leave, and they didn't attempt to stop me or follow me in any way, which was a monumental relief. "I'm amazed you weren't scared of the creatures," I said. Well, in truth, the only fear I felt at the time was actually not having my cousin with me when my mother returned from her trip. My cousin was hitting me and telling me that he wanted to get back to play with his friend. I told him in no uncertain terms that we were going back home, and when I tried to question him about what had actually happened over the last 4 days, all he could do was giggle, as if everything was all just terribly funny, and all he could say was that the bears were very, very nice. I kid you not. Talk about perfect timing. It was literally 15 minutes later when my aunt and mother arrived back home from their long trip. My aunt was appalled to see her son caked in mud, wearing no bottoms at all. I think she thought I was too lazy to put any nappies on him, and was letting him go au naturel to avoid washing soiled nappies. "What have you been doing with George?" she piped. "Where are his pants? And why is he completely caked in mud? I knew I should never have trusted him in your charge. Never in all my born days have I seen him so filthy before. He looks like he's been rolling around in the mud like a pig. What on earth have you been doing with him, girl?" When she discovered that I hadn't changed her son's clothes and nappies in over 4 days, she was utterly appalled. "I never expected you to be this lazy, Dorothy," she piped. "You have not bothered to use any nappies or even change my son's clothes. No wonder he stinks to high heaven. He smells like an open sewer. You should be ashamed of yourself, girl." And she quickly went to give her son a long bath, in which there was much screaming, protesting and crying coming from little George. Of course, she never did find out what had really happened to her son, although I gather she did think I'd read him all kinds of stories about bears, because he kept telling her that the bears were much nicer than she was, and they would let him play, eat berries, and spend lots of time in the mud. Of course, my aunt thought that I was the big bear that George was talking about. "Wow," I said, "that was some story. By the way, did your mum win first prize for the strawberry jam like she hoped she would?" "Oh, you bet she won first prize. But she went to the grave without telling me the secret to her strawberry jam recipe, and I never forgave her for that. I do remember they had a wonderful time at the show, though, and my mother told me that there was a farmer who won first prize for a pumpkin that weighed over 2,556 pounds, and she said it was the most impressive pumpkin that she'd ever seen in her entire life." "Wow," I said, "that's an incredible story." So that was the extraordinary Bigfoot story that Dorothy revealed to me. I do remember her disease progressed, and she had less and less bouts of lucidity. But a few hours before her death, she seemed so perky and upbeat, and I knew that this was the golden hour. So I alerted all her family members and asked them to come and say their goodbyes while they had the chance. Even though Dorothy was a religious person with a solid, secure faith in God, it did not mean her death was easy, most especially for those of us who loved her, as let's face it, death is a contentious subject at the very best of times. But Dorothy approached her death with courage and strength, and she was not scared to die, but described it as the next part of her great adventure. "I'm not afraid," she told us. "I've already been receiving visitations from deceased family members, and I've been told they'll be coming to collect me at 2:00. I kid you not, at 2:02, Dorothy had died, and the room was enveloped in a beautiful warm radiance, and as odd as this sounds, she died with a huge smile upon her face, and looked incredibly peaceful. I remember she looked up from her bed and said, 'Oh, it's so beautiful, so beautiful,' and then she died. So there you are. That's my story."
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Ashley Jenkins, and I'm writing to tell you about two curious occurrences that happened to me growing up. In some bizarre way, they are related because of my ghost experience. I rarely became open to alternative realities and began to realize that our lives are not as clear-cut as we may think they are. I realized that there was so much more to our reality than just what we think and what we can physically see. And so I assure you, after this, my first supernatural encounter, I was definitely not one of the doubters as far as Bigfoot was concerned. I was open to the possibility of absolutely anything, which in a strange way gives you so much freedom in your life, because you are free to explore even improbable things with an open mind, and that is incredibly liberating. So on with my story. First of all, I would like to tell you that I'm half English and half American. I was born in Hampshire in England to my English mother and my American father. When I was 12 years old, we moved to a beautiful English country cottage in the heart of the Hampshire countryside. The cottage was over 400 years old, so it had immense character and charm, and the English loved their historic buildings. The stone cottage, covered with its red rambling climbing roses and flourishing purple wisteria, really gave you the feeling of stepping back in time. Beautiful large-style French windows were ubiquitous in every room in the house, enabling the interiors to be light, fresh and airy, as well as offering the most ravishing views over the beautiful meadows beyond. The front door was painted in a bright red enamel, which rarely brought out the colours of the masterful stonework that had stood the test of time. The cottage was listed as a Grade 2 historic building, as no modern alterations could be done to the cottage without seeking planning permission first. The garden was very small and quaint, with a few apple trees dotted around the place here and there, and it was fenced in by a wicket-style fence that consisted of 2 wooden panels. It overlooked the most beautiful backdrop of rolling hills, stunning and glorious meadows and forest. On many occasions there were beautiful racehorses in the field belonging to the lord of the manor, who lived in a huge mansion behind us. He was fanatical about racing his thoroughbreds, which were among the most magnificent regal horses that I have ever seen. I always remember giving them polo mints, which they loved, and apples from my tree over the fence. They really had the loveliest personable natures. Sometimes the lord of the manor let out the field to a neighbouring farmer, and then we would have sheep in the field, and that was also fun. On one occasion I even got to raise a little lamb on a bottle, and it was the cutest thing I'd ever seen. He grew up believing that he was a dog, as he followed our dog Oscar everywhere he went, and imitated him to the top in everything he did, like catching a ball, lifting his leg over a bush to pee, and rolling over in delight to have his stomach scratched. When I returned the lamb to the farmer, he was amazed to see that the creature gravitated towards his own working sheepdogs and ignored the other sheep in the field because he thought he was a sheepdog too. So the farmer raised him as one of his dogs, and he even assisted them in chasing after the other sheep. I gather he remained a happy member of their family for many years. Luckily for him, he avoided ending up as a tasty leg of lamb on the dinner table. My family settled into village life very quickly, and we were welcomed by all the people who lived in the village, who were warm and friendly. We would have village fetes and vegetable competitions to see who would grow the largest vegetables in their gardens. I kid you not, some of those pumpkins were monstrously huge. Fox hunting with hounds was also common in the village, and an occasion of regal pomp and ceremony. The horn would be blown, initiating the start of the hunt, and then the riders, dressed in their bright red jackets and white jodhpurs, would go galloping through the countryside until the hounds had traced the smell of the fox, and it would not be long before they had gathered their trophy in between their excitable jaws, and would wrestle each other over the prize in between yaps of delirious delight. My story starts when I'd come back from a trip to Ireland on the ferry to visit my great-grandmother, and I think I must have caught chicken pox from one of the people on that ferry crossing. I know that the next morning I broke out in this huge rash all over my body of tan-coloured spots, and I was not sure what it was, and neither were my parents, but they knew that they should call out the doctor in case whatever I had was infectious. My parents called for the doctor to come at 11 o'clock that morning, and so when we heard a loud knocking at our front door at 10 o'clock, we were surprised that the doctor had arrived a whole hour earlier than was scheduled, but gladly we let him into our home. Imagine my father's surprise when he opened the door to a man wearing a huge top hat from another time. He was dressed with a crisp white shirt and a black jacket with tails and black pants, and the shiniest black shoes you have ever seen, that you could literally see your reflection in. He was also wearing one of those old-fashioned pocket watches. My father was amused by the doctor's appearance. He was used to the oddity and quirky behaviours of the English by now, and so thought that this man, whoever he was an eccentric type, or maybe he was dressing up for some kind of role play for an English historic event. Those sort of things do happen often in our part of the world. "You must be the doctor," he said. "I like the tails thingy," he said, pointing to the doctor's jacket in humour. "Would you like to come in?" "How is she?" asked the doctor. "I got your message and came immediately." "Oh, I thought you were coming at 11, said my father. "Our daughter is covered all over with brown spots, and we are just a little concerned about her." "All in good time," said the doctor. In his hands he carried an old-fashioned doctor's case. He entered my bedroom with a huge smile. "How is the patient?" he asked, touching my forehead with his hands. When he did that, I felt a rush of cold air go right through my whole body, and I did remark on how cold his hands were. He examined my spots and told me that I had chicken pox, and that it was very common and could be very serious if you did not look after yourself. "Chicken pox? Common?" asked my father in surprise. "I thought we had eradicated it with all the advances in vaccines. Should she have not been vaccinated from it?" The doctor did not reply. Instead, he opened his strange suitcase and proceeded to examine my ears. and asked me to open my mouth so that he could look at the back of my throat. "Say ah," he said. "Ah, say ah, ah." And he looked into the back of my throat with a weird-looking instrument, but such that I have never seen before. "Just make sure you give her plenty of fluids, lots of fresh chicken broth, and plenty of rest. You cannot go out until you are no longer infectious. That will be all," he said, and with that he tottered out of the house and vanished. The next thing we knew was that someone was knocking on the door. "Not again," groaned my father. "Who is it now?" My dad opened the door to a gentleman wearing a white doctor's coat over his clothes. He told my baffled father that he was the call-out doctor for my 11 o'clock appointment. "We have already seen the doctor who came out to see my daughter at 11. He diagnosed her with chickenpox." The doctor was perplexed, his forehead wrinkles furrowed, with an expression of confusion on his face. "I don't understand that. I'm the only one on duty for call-outs in the Hampshire area this morning," he said, looking completely floored. "What did you say this person looked like? Maybe I might know him." My father described the doctor who had attended the earlier appointment with me. "You sound like you're talking about a ghost," laughed the doctor jovially. "There's no one working for us that looks remotely like that. Are you sure someone is not winding you up or playing a joke on you?" "I hope not," said my father, ushering the doctor inside and looking extremely bewildered. The doctor examined me and confirmed the previous diagnosis from the first doctor, and that I did indeed have chickenpox. Imagine my shock when I found out later from my next-door neighbour that the doctor that visited me had been dead for many long years. He had died in 1924 on the 21st of February. I even got to visit his gravestone in the local cemetery, and there it was. His name was William Gladstone. He had lived in my neighbour's house during the Victorian times and would perform house calls within the Hampshire area. My neighbour showed my family a picture of the doctor, and it was the very man who had visited me the day that I was sick. I remember he was as real and lifelike as you and me, and that is what astonished me most. And his hands had been cold to the touch, but they were physically real, and that is a promise. How was this possible, I wondered? I was also to learn that this very same doctor had indeed visited 2 other people in the village when they fell sick, and they had had very similar experiences to me. I only saw this Victorian doctor one more time. He was walking along the village green at about 6 p.m. in the evening. I knew it was him. I recognized him in his top hat and tails. And then he just vanished before my eyes. That was the final confirmation for me that this man was indeed a ghost, because nothing just vanishes before your eyes like that. When I turned 14, my parents moved to North America, where we bought a beautiful cabin in the Tennessee countryside. I adored and loved my new life in America, and the locals there were so warm and friendly and welcoming to us in our new abode. It was not long before I heard someone talking about a person in the area who had seen a Bigfoot and was making fun of them by saying it was all a load of tot. I immediately asked him to explain to me what Bigfoot was, because at that stage I'd never heard of the creature. He told me in detail about the so-called hairy man, but was adamant that they did not exist. I was not so sure, because my mind was open, as I told you before, to any possibility, especially after my astonishingly ghostly encounter a couple of years before. One night in our home we heard whooping sounds coming from the wooded area of our land, and I was excited because I thought it could be a Bigfoot. My father told me not to go and investigate because he knew my curious nature. I was not about to listen to my dad. I never have when I'm being stubborn about something, but I waited for him and my mother to retire to bed. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I could hear my dad's loud snores. I slipped out into the woods wearing my nightgown with a pair of sneakers, and I carried a torch in my hands. It never even crossed my mind to carry a shotgun, probably because I come from England initially. I've never been afraid of the dark either, or really anything for that matter. All my life I tended to gravitate towards boyish things that just were so much more exciting for me, because boys are always adventurous, and I loved that. It was a dark evening and very quiet compared to normal, and I was surprised to hear that there were no crickets singing, but nothing on this earth would have discouraged me from the eager hope and expectation that I might even catch a glimpse of the elusive hairy man. As I approached the woods, I definitely heard wood knocks, and that made me extremely excited. I was now almost certain Bigfoot had to be around, and while I did not want to face a confrontation with the creature, I just wanted to see one with all my heart. The ground of the forest floor was covered with gold leaf litter and pieces of broken twigs, so it was exceedingly difficult to walk without making a noise. But believe me, I tried to be as quiet as I possibly could, which was far from easy, because the forest was so silent you could have heard a pin drop. Suddenly I heard someone whistling, which surprised me because I did not expect a human to be in the woods at night, and I did not know that Bigfoots could whistle. I could hear them walking as they crunched the leaves beneath their feet. I took the opportunity to hide behind a tree so that I could steal a glimpse of who was coming. I switched off the light of my torch and stood against the trunk listening. The person, whoever he was, continued to whistle, and he sounded heavy and large as he moved. He must be a big guy, I thought, whoever this person was walking around in the woods at night. It was most peculiar, but having lived in England for so long, I knew about eccentricities and oddities more than most. So a weird guy taking a late stroll in the middle of the night was not completely off my radar after all my experiences. I could hear that the person had entered the area close to where I was hiding, and I peeked at him expecting to see a man, and imagine my surprise when I discovered I was looking at a larger-than-life Bigfoot. I cannot begin to tell you in any words how thrilled and excited and overwhelmed with joy I felt. My heart was beating at 1,000 miles an hour, not from fear, but from the awe and wonder of this amazing and spectacular animal. It was dark in the forest, but the gaps in between the branches from the fallen leaves gave me some light, because it was late autumn and it enabled the moonlight to come through the trees. And that was when I got a good glimpse of the creature. He was about 6 foot tall, I think, and he had a bullet-shaped head, and much to my surprise, he did not appear to have any neck. It was like his head was stuck on those massive shoulders, which was peculiar. I noticed the torso was big, and I could tell that he had the flattest stomach ever, slender hips, and very strong, lean, muscular legs. He was covered in hair, but there were areas on his body where you could see the underlying grey skin, like on parts of his stomach, his knees, and his face. I could also see his genitals, so I knew he was a male. I could not see the details of his face, but I did detect some red eye shine. Suddenly I heard a knocking sound coming from further in the forest, and the creature answered by slapping his hand against the wood hard. It was amazing. It seemed only moments later that another Bigfoot appeared, but it was standing in a spot that was way too dark for me to see it clearly. It just looked like a large, shadowy mass of black. I could hear the two creatures chattering together non-stop, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, and it sounded like a language that was spoken very fast. The creature I could see clearly took 3 dead rabbits from the other creature and carried them by their legs upside down and proceeded to walk back into the forest. And they chattered all the way like they were enjoying an amazing conversation. I will never know whether they knew I was hiding there or not. Anyway, whether they did or didn't, I'm glad that they ignored me, because a one-on-one encounter, even for me, may have been a little intimidating and overwhelming. So there you are. Those are my 2 stories that made me a believer of the unexplained and supernatural. And one thing is for sure, I know that Bigfoot is real. I hope you enjoyed my story. I just want to say that that was an amazing story. I love the fact that we got introduced to the English lifestyle and then we go into an American lifestyle, and two very different encounters, both which were absolutely extraordinary. I really loved the visitation of the doctor coming to see you and being larger than life and being real, and the fact that other people in that village had experienced the very same thing that you did. That was amazing. And the fact that you actually got to see a Bigfoot and believed in him without doubting, that in itself is incredible, because that takes faith. And maybe that's what we need, is to have a little faith and an open mind.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Meryl, and after my grandmother died a couple of years ago, I painstakingly went through her things with a fine tooth comb, as I've always been a fabulous organiser, and I didn't want to throw out anything of value. I discovered an old shoebox among her items with some letters she had written to her parents as a young girl, along with pictures she had done as a feisty 6-year-old. You know the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Really cute drawings done in crayon of happy families, bright sunshine, blue sky, flying birds and little houses. Then there were hundreds upon hundreds of letters that she had written to Father Christmas. One was so adorable that I thought I had to share it with you. It read, "Father Christmas, I'd like you to get my mother a brand new nose for Christmas, because hers is very horrible, because it has hay fever attached to it, and it's not a nice nose, because it's stopping me from getting a pet. I want a big white fluffy cat, but Mummy needs a new nose first, which is urgent. Thank you. Love, Patsy." Among her items I discovered a letter she had written to her mother as a young teenage girl. I do not know why I read it, but for some reason I couldn't help myself, and I sat on the edge of the bed and read the entire letter, which described her encounter with an erroneous, idiosyncratic creature that I believe emphatically was a Bigfoot. I only regret that I never discussed with her the existence of such an unorthodox creature living in North America, as I had absolutely no idea at the time that she had such a meaningful encounter as a young girl with what I believe was a Bigfoot. Maybe she chose not to share her story with anyone, as people do tend to be secretive or guarded about such matters for fear of ridicule. It would never ever have occurred to me to discuss such a topic as Bigfoot with her, which I now seriously regret. From what I could gather, she was sent to stay at her grandparents' farm in Georgia as a young teenage girl, when her father was taken ill with a rather peculiar condition that caused bizarre symptoms such as great weakness, bouts of dizziness, high temperatures and nausea. At the time, many of his doctors misdiagnosed his rather strange, peculiar condition, which he had acquired from a trip to Africa, where he contracted the hepatitis B virus, otherwise known as yellow jaundice, from which he made a full recovery. I gather he believed he contracted the liver disease from a witch doctor that he was writing an article about for National Geographic magazine, who stored all kinds of rotting bones in his hut, many that were used in some of his peculiar rituals. I believe my grandmother's mother wanted her daughter safely out of the house, as her husband was placed in strict quarantine for several weeks, as he was still infectious. I gather when his skin turned bright yellow that he began to feel a lot better, and when that happened, finally the doctors diagnosed him accurately, because by then it was pretty clear what his condition was. As a young girl, it would seem my grandmother wrote very eloquent letters to her mother while staying at her grandparents' farm that I believe will be of interest to your listeners. My dearest mother, how much I miss you, mother dear, but I assure you that you are not far from my thoughts, and I do hope that father's recovery from his yellow jaundice is progressing swiftly and speedily, and that before long he will be as right as rain. I think he must have looked very strange and peculiar when his skin turned bright yellow, but it is good that it is not the dangerous form of hepatitis like the other viruses, namely B and C, I think it is. Grandma could not believe it when I told her that his urine was the colour of Coca-Cola, as she said that such a sight in her toilet pan would cause her to have a very serious heart attack. It sounds like his bland, fat-free diet must be exceedingly boring for him. I know how much Dad loves the crackling from his pork roast, so he must be feeling dreadfully deprived and very aggrieved. Grandma believes that when he is better, he should come and stay here on the farm, because the fresh air, she says, is good for the soul and strengthens and nourishes the mind. I do believe she's absolutely right about that. I'm sorry I haven't written sooner, but I've been very busy of late, helping out on the farm, as there's always dozens of tasks to be done, and all hands are on deck at the moment, as Grandma is not afraid to work me very hard. I don't mind, of course, because I enjoy keeping busy. I usually awaken early in the morning before the sun begins to rise, when it's still very dark outside. The now yellowing grass is seemingly always covered in a thick white layer of frost. It is very difficult to get up when there's an icy chill in the air, but Grandma says the winters here are usually mild. I'm not sure I'm inclined to agree with her, as it's been very cold of late, and we've had a bout of freezing rain, which isn't funny at all, as when it rains, it freezes just like sleet. I'm invariably always woken by the noisy roosters making a raucous commotion outside. My first job of the morning is to collect all the eggs, and we have a hen that is always producing double yolks. I have yet to see her produce a one-yolk egg, and so I have called her Two Yolks, which Grandma thinks is terribly funny, and the name seems to have stuck. I am also responsible for leading the American quarter horses into the pasture to graze, and collect a barrel of hay from the barn for them, which I lay out in the pastures, as during the winter they need a lot of extra food. After I have attended to the horses, I help Grandma prepare the breakfast, and my all-time favourite is pancakes with maple syrup, blueberries and clotted cream. And Grandma's pancakes are absolutely delicious. I think she says the secret ingredient is buttermilk, which really makes the pancakes very fluffy. After breakfast I get involved in all kinds of laborious jobs, like mucking out the stables, cleaning the saddles, or brushing the horses. The latter is rather enjoyable, as I like being close to the horses and talking to them, and they love being brushed. My favourite part of the day is taking Eternal Flame, which is the dark brown horse with a black mane and tail that I'm expected to exercise. I take her out for her daily trot, and nothing is more glorious than trotting out of the farm gate, down some of those quaint rugged country roads, as everything is so tranquil and peaceful, and I love being surrounded by nature. And there's also a lot of indigenous wildlife in the area. I've seen quite a few red foxes during the daytime, and they're so beautiful. You should have seen how spectacular and magnificent the scenery was here during the autumn. I've never seen anything more magnificent in my entire life, as the brandywine maples, dogwoods and ash trees were literally transformed into an exquisite variety of blazing reds, and the sugar maples became like a burnt orange colour, while the magnolia trees turned yellow. I was transfixed by their resplendent colours, so it's such a pity that the autumn was so fleeting, as all the trees have now lost their leaves. Grandma tells me that spring in Georgia is bedazzling, when the trees burst into pink, white and yellow blossoms. She says it's ever so pretty. I have a very strange story to relate to you, which is my biggest reason for writing, as I simply have to tell someone about my very bizarre experience, and I know you will believe my account, for I have never been predisposed to telling you lies, and I'm not about to start now. And I assure you that in no way is my story exaggerated. I think it began on a bitterly cold Tuesday morning, as I do remember that I was shivering quite badly, despite the fact that I was wearing my very chunky coat. I was gathering the hay from the red storage barn to feed the horses, and that was when I noticed what I thought was a large, bedraggled sack in the corner of the barn, lying close to a large white sack of animal feed. I didn't pay it much attention, of course, as Grandpa has all kinds of odds and ends in that barn of his. I wanted to get my chores done as quickly as possible so I could return to the warm, cosy kitchen for breakfast, as the wood-burning stove in there keeps that kitchen as warm as toast. I went out to unload the hay in the field for the horses, and when I returned to the barn, I just happened to glance towards that strange, bedraggled-looking sack again, and I could see that it seemed to move. It happened so quickly that I really thought I must be imagining things, but I decided to investigate it anyway, as my curiosity got the better of me. I did think I might have seen a rat scurrying across the ground, eating grain from a hole in the sack, but that is not what I found. Lying on the ground was this grey rug that was covered in mud, and it looked like a mass of ropey hair. Using my foot, I pressed down on this vertical bumpy heap, not knowing exactly what it was, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when I realised that this thing, whatever it was, appeared to be breathing and was very much alive. I poked it again to see if I could get a reaction from this large erroneous bundle of hair, and believe me, I did. All of a sudden this creature sat bolt upright and looked directly at me through dark, very frightened eyes. Mother, I have never seen a stranger-looking critter in all my life, and the only way I can describe it to you is that it looked remarkably human, but was covered in long, straggly hair that was matted and very dirty. It was much bigger in size than your average human being, of course, with overlong arms and a large head that was shaped like a big arch, that was almost stuck to the shoulders, as I didn't actually discern a neck. I realised that the creature was exceedingly old, and seemed scared of me, so I spoke to it very gently to calm it down, and it visibly began to relax. Its leathery grey face was weathered and deeply tanned. The face was heavily wrinkled, and the skin tough, rather like a rhino hide. It possessed gentle, deep-set dark eyes, and one of them appeared to be clouding over with a white film, which may mean he had a cataract of some kind, because I don't think he could see from that eye very well. I'm sure he was seeking shelter in the barn to keep out of the freezing rain, and I could discern that the poor thing was shivering and shaking violently, despite the fact that it was covered in long hair, although there were areas on his torso where the hair was literally quite scant. I believe it was emaciated, frail, enfeebled and wasted, but I think at one time when he was in the fullness of his youth and in his prime, he would have been a very large, strapping critter indeed. I decided not to tell Grandpa about what I'd seen, as I think he would be none too pleased that he was harbouring some outlandish creature in the barn, and I think if he'd seen it for himself, he might have put it out of its misery with that gruesome rifle of his that he is almost too eager to use at any time. But that was not going to happen on my watch. I know it sounds rather strange, Mum, but I really warmed to this creature. He was like a wizened old man, with so much life experience behind him, but from nature, of course. I liked him. I don't know why, but I did. I returned to the barn with lots of Grandmother's old blankets, and I covered the creature with them, and he looked heartily relieved to be shielded from the icy air. I could discern the thankfulness in his eyes, as he stopped shivering almost at once. I also perceived the creature might be very hungry, and so I secretly brought the creature a pile of pancakes with maple syrup and blueberries, and he gobbled those pancakes down so fast that I realised he was exceedingly hungry, and I watched him lick the plate clean with his large pink tongue, which actually made me laugh, especially when he handed the plate back to me and indicated that he wanted more. I returned to the kitchen and promptly fried up some more pancakes, and Grandma was shocked to see me cooking more of them. She falsely assumed I was planning to eat them all for myself, which made me appear very gluttonous. She said if I wasn't careful I'd end up blowing up like the little girl Violet in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that blew up into a giant blueberry and had to be dejuiced because she was so huge. Over the next few days I was drawn to visiting the creature, whom I'm sure was very, very old. Before long he seemed comforted by my presence and would respond to me with a series of gentle grunts. I would sit down on a haystack not far from where he was lying and read him my books. I just thought he might appreciate my company, and I truly think he did. As I read to him he would listen to my stories, and he seemed comforted by my presence and my voice. I really did sense he was dying. I don't know how I knew this, but it was a feeling I had in my gut. When the creature was in pain, he would sometimes flinch, and then I would go and get him some painkillers, which really eased his discomfort considerably, although I gave him a higher dose, given his great size. He began to trust me to take care of him, and I really enjoyed nursing him. One day I slipped into the barn in the late evening, after Grandma and Grandpa had long since retired to bed. I had observed the strange creature was refusing food during the day, which led me to believe he didn't have long left to live. I couldn't bear for him to die alone. That thought for me was inconceivable. How could I lie back in a warm bed, while this hairy humanoid was lying in the barn, slowly dying. It was a bitterly cold night, and a brisk easterly wind was blowing and thundering against the house so vigorously that even the shutters were hammering noisily against the windows, and the whistling trees, devoid of any leaves, were swaying, and Grandma's wind chime was tinkling in the wind. It was quite a frisky night, and the wind wasn't friendly at all. I crept out of the house, wrapped in a large blanket, and entered the barn quietly, putting on the light, which was ever so dim. I quickly wedged a brick in the door so it didn't slam too violently, with that heavy wind blowing so forcefully outside. I ambled towards the creature and sat down very close to him, stroking his hair gently, reassuring him and speaking to him very softly. I could hear him emit a low mumble in response to my voice, and sense that he was relieved not to be all on his own. I felt so happy to be with him. I kept stroking his soft mane of hair, and telling him how beautiful he was, how much I really liked him, and how much I would miss him terribly when he went away. I lay by his side on the ground, and put my arms around him, although in truth he was too big to cuddle, but I didn't care about that. I felt like I was cuddling up to a great big old teddy bear of mine. All of a sudden, two colossal hairy humanoids burst into the barn like two rambunctious bulls in a china shop, and hurriedly scurried towards my sick friend. And on seeing me for a second, they were rather hesitant and wary, but they quickly overcame their reserve and uncertainty, and promptly sat down on the ground next to their friend, while I continued to cuddle up to him. Mother, you have no idea how monstrously big these humanoid creatures actually were. I should have been terrified by them, because they were powerful, imposing, and exceedingly intimidating, but I wasn't fearful or on edge, for I sensed they meant me no harm. They were easily 7 foot tall, very wide around the girth, with enormous shoulders and covered in dark brown hair that was scant around the knees and under the arm area. I could see that they knew this creature very well, and were possibly related to him in some way. They were aggrieved and distressed by his rapidly deteriorating condition, but also resigned to his obvious plight, as they absolutely knew he was dying. I was exceedingly glad that they did not display any animosity towards me, but were benevolent and even friendly, but not in an effusive way, as I sensed their shy reticence. In truth, I think they were quite surprised to see how incredibly attached I was to their dying friend. I didn't move from my position, but kept my hand on the dying creature's body, and the two large creatures also placed their hands on him, as we were all waiting for the heart to finally stop. It was a poignant moment, as all three of us were united in our grief, and when the creature breathed his last, the two hairy humanoids beat their chests in distress and began to wail bitterly, while I sat there crying with tears pouring down my face. The very large humanoid creature gathered the dead body in his arms and glided away out of the barn alongside his friend, and they bounded through the trees together and were finally gone. I think they were going to bury my friend. I remember bursting into tears, as the barn had become so empty without him. His large presence had filled such a big place in my heart, and I felt so sad. I knew I would miss him dreadfully, as silly and as peculiar as that may sound. I truly had grown incredibly attached to the creature. I think it must have been about 2 days after the big creature had died. I kid you not, when I went into the barn to collect some hay, there was a beautiful western bluebird perched on a haystack next to where the creature had actually died. It began to tweet and sing joyfully, and it flew out of the barn and followed me. It perched on the fence singing while I fed the horses, and then finally it flew away. It was an extraordinary spiritual experience for me, and I felt the bird had been sent to me by my dead friend, as if to say that he was now at peace. The following morning, when I was acquiring some more hay for the horses, I saw something shimmering on the ground where my friend had previously lain, and I found a white stone on the ground with a red stone inside it, which Grandma told me is a garnet, and I think it was left for me by the creatures as a gift, so I'm going to treasure it always. Grandma thinks it's a very special stone, and literally asked me where I found it, but I have no intention of sharing my secret with her. Other than that, I haven't got any exciting news to share with you. although it does seem that some snow is forecast very soon. And I hope there'll be enough to go sledging and make a snowman, for that indeed would be fun. Please send Daddy all my love and tell him to get better soon. All my love, Patsy. So that was the letter my grandmother wrote as a young girl, and in the box I found the white stone containing the garnet, which I too shall always treasure. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was in the summer of 1963, and I was about 15 years old, and I was sitting in the kitchen of our farmhouse, which overlooked spectacular scenic views of the emerald green Kentucky countryside that was heavily flanked by large clusters of trees. It had been raining cats and dogs, and the heavens had opened, and it had poured and poured unceasingly, with the hard but rhythmic patter and tapping sounds of the rain hitting the roof of our 1800s farmhouse. My grandmother was boiling a kettle of water on the stove, and it began to whistle away cheerfully, and the smell of the warm chicken casserole on the hob bubbled away, and the delicious smells permeated and wafted over the entire kitchen. I stared out of the windows, comfortably seated at the large oak kitchen table, where I was supposed to be catching up with some of my homework, but I was busy daydreaming and seemingly mesmerised and transfixed by the rain and almost lost in a meditational trance. I watched the sky darken, almost as if a dimmer switch had turned down the light, and that was when I heard yet more ominous, portentous, loud booms and rumbles of thunder that were so frightfully loud that I almost jumped out of my skin. The sky flashed with the yellow vertical jagged lines of an electric storm, and much like a flash of a camera, the kitchen was briefly lit up by a bright luminescent light, which was followed yet again by another fulminating, ear-piercing boom. "That is quite some storm," said my grandmother. "I pity anyone out there caught up in it." All of a sudden, bursting through the trees, and moving at a very fast, rapid pace, with the grace and stealth of a cheetah, was the dark, shadowy silhouette of a giant tall figure, gliding elegantly towards our farmhouse, and it appeared to be carrying something over its shoulders like a large, heavy sack of potatoes, and that was when our kitchen door spontaneously just flung wide open, and something was gently thrust onto the floor, and whatever it was, it stood up as tall as a man, and then bent down into a crawling position and scurried and crawled under the table on all fours like a frightened animal. I could hear water being treaded under hefty feet, and I briefly glanced out of the window and could see this giant being swinging his overlong arms backwards and forwards as he seemingly floated above the ground, moving as fast as the wind, with an elegance and grace of note. It was covered in what appeared to look like wet dreadlocks of hair, and then it darted into the trees and disappeared from my sight. What was that thing, I wondered? Everything had been blurred, hazy, misty and foggy because of the rain, and I couldn't determine what it was that I had discerned, as everything had happened so fast. In that moment I did begin to wonder if I'd seen it at all, as everything appeared so sketchy and vague. My grandmother looked startled, as her eyes were staring in horror at the wet kitchen floor, now covered in pools of water. She was wearing a bemused, bewildered expression upon her face, as if to say, "What the heck just happened there? And what on earth is hiding under our table?" I bent down from my chair, lowering down my upper torso so that my head peered beneath the table, where I discerned a very bedraggled, wet, hunched-up form that I realised at once was a young teenage boy, possibly around about the very same age as myself, with saucer-wide, terrified eyes. I noticed that every time the sky cracked with thunder and boomed like a heavy drum, the boy seemed to become ever so frantic. I realised instinctively that he was spooked and affrighted by the resounding storm, and rather reminded me of a dog we once owned called Thor, which in fact means thunder, who was ironically completely petrified by storms, much like this boy was, who exhibited exactly the same behaviour as my dog used to. "It's a boy," I whispered to my grandmother. "I think he's scared of the storm." "Just leave him be," said my grandmother. "Wait until the storm recedes, and then we'll try and help him. He's possibly frightened by that deafening, ear-splitting noise, and who can blame him? Even I am shaking," she said. After the electrifying storm receded, my grandmother managed to coax the boy out from under the table with her reassuring, gentle voice. "It's all safe now," she said gently. "The storm has stopped. You can come out now." "Don't send me back," begged the boy, climbing out from under the table and standing up straight at an impressive 6 foot tall. He was trembling anxiously and regarding my grandmother with a pleading look on his face. "Mr. Richards will kill me. I know he will, if you send me back." "No one is sending you anywhere," said my grandmother reassuringly. "You can stay here as long as you like. In the meantime, I'd like you to get off those sopping clothes. You're drenched and soaked to the skin, and I think you could do with a nice hot bath. You look very filthy, boy." "Howard," she said, addressing me, "please go and get this boy some of your clothes to wear. I think he's about your size. In the meantime, I'll run him a hot bath." After the boy was finally dry and dressed in some of my clothes, I realised that he definitely was about my age and my height, which made him quite tall, actually. He never said a word as he watched my grandmother plate him up a large portion of hot chicken casserole, which he gobbled up very hungrily, and even lifted up the plate to his face and began to lick the plate clean with his tongue, much like a dog, which made me smile because it was kind of funny. My grandmother said, "I'm so glad you enjoyed my casserole, boy. What's your name, young man?" "Don't send me back," pleaded the boy again. "Don't send me back, I beg you. The Richards will kill me. I know they will. They're not nice people." "No one is sending you anywhere," my grandmother repeated reassuringly. "But where are you from, boy? Who are your parents? They must be terribly worried about you by now." "I don't have parents," said the boy. "I live in a foster home with the Richards, but I ran away 2 weeks ago." "Oh dear," said my grandmother, her heart melting like butter and her face softening considerably. "Why did you run away, boy? Did they treat you bad at your foster home? Now, we're not going to make you go back, that I can promise you, but we can't help you until you tell us exactly what happened to you. How on earth did you manage to survive for 2 weeks on your own without parental supervision?" So this was the boy's story that he told us in his very own words. "My name is Michael, and I'm 15 years old. For the first 9 years of my life, I was lucky to spend it at a Catholic orphanage, where I was taken care of by the nuns there. They were loving and very motherly towards me, especially Sister Agnes, who I really loved. She took charge of me, and loved me as if I was her own child. I remember she was devastated when I left the orphanage, but Mother Superior said that it was just as well. She said I needed to leave because Sister Agnes was becoming too attached to me. I deserved to have a full life and a loving family. The orphanage arranged my adoption through social services, where I was to be adopted by a very loving family who was eager to have a child of their own. It would seem the woman who was to become my adopted mother was struggling to fall pregnant with little success. So I moved in with the couple, and I kid you not, before the paperwork actually arrived for my adoption to be finalised, the couple discovered that my potential mother had miraculously fallen pregnant. All of a sudden, the couple both abandoned me and decided they didn't want to adopt me after all. So began my nefarious journey into the dark, shady world of fostering. In the beginning, I was fostered by a few families, but I never stayed in one location for very long, as my living arrangements were always temporary, and no one adopted me permanently, as I think I wasn't cute enough. People prefer to adopt babies, not little boys like me, just like at an animal shelter, where they invariably always choose the kittens over the cats, or the puppies over the dogs every time. Wherever I lived, I felt like an outsider who didn't belong, but I chose to develop a thick skin about it and not let it get me down emotionally. I knew I wasn't related to these people by blood, so they weren't going to look on me with the same kind of devotion as they clearly showed to their own biological offspring, even if their own kids were in fact the biggest brats, which was often the case. One day I moved in with a family called the Richards, who had 3 natural children of their own, and they decided to take me on as a foster child, as a favour to the church. When I went to the church on Sunday with the Richards, they acted like the salt of the earth, and they would put their arms around me so lovingly as if I was an inclusive, beloved member of their family. And this false display of affection towards me in front of all the congregation made me sick to my stomach. It was complete hypocrisy as far as I was concerned, because at home my foster family were anything but loving, and they treated me with disdain and contempt, like I was the dog muck at the bottom of their shoes. Those people at church would say, "Mr. and Mrs. Richards, you are the most selfless, generous people taking on a foster child like this. May the Lord God bless you for your goodness." And it would make me want to vomit. Of course I had to go along with their insidious charade to keep the peace, or believe me, if I stepped out of line, I would be in big trouble with the Richards. Everyone looked on Mr. Richard as a pillar of society and a rock of the community, with a reverent awe. He would get on to the pew after the pastor's sermon and start reading the Bible and preaching all about love and forgiveness, as if he was an authority on the subject, but he never practiced what he preached, never. I promise you, based on illusory, delusive appearances, you would have believed he was a godly man, but he was without doubt a wolf dressed up in sheep's clothing. When that pugnacious man got home, he became a belligerent, truculent bully, and after a few drinks, he morphed into an aggressive, antagonistic, confrontational tyrant that swore unceasingly, using all kinds of unholy obscenities, which was a complete antithesis to what he portrayed himself to be. Mr. Richards would get upset and indignant over the most insignificant things. If we had run out of milk during breakfast time, invariably the blame would be directed at me, and I would be accused of drinking it all, when I don't even like the stuff. My foster mother would blame me for absolutely everything. I remember her pointing at me indignantly and saying, "Before you moved into our house, Michael, we never ever ran out of milk. But now you've moved in, there's never enough milk to be had. And we're always running out of bread for the toaster. You're eating us out of house and home, young man." None of that was true, of course, but that was irrelevant, because the Richards got some kind of warped pleasure from treading on me with unkind words and reprimands. My foster father regularly punched me, and this sort of contentious, reckless behaviour happened all the time. I rarely sensed he enjoyed beating me up, as I discerned a satisfied smirk on his face every time. "That's insane," said my grandmother. "That man needs locking up, treating a child like that. What on earth is this world coming to?" One day when I was fast asleep in my bed, I was pulled out of my duvet by Mr. Richards' beefy, very large arms. He was a big fellow and very strong. He dragged me, kicking and screaming, to the kitchen fridge, where my head was promptly thrust into the refrigerator. I could feel the icy air on my face as he began screaming and shrieking at me. "Where's my ribeye steak, boy?" he demanded. "What have you done with it? I know you've eaten it, you greedy, greedy pig." I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath, and I said to him, "Sir, you ate your ribeye steak earlier this evening. I saw you cook it myself. I never touched it." At that, Mr. Richards became incensed, because talking back to him was inflammatory, and it made him as mad as a rabid dog. And when I say mad, I mean really, really mad. "Don't lie to me, boy," he shrieked. "I know you ate my ribeye steak. I know you did." And he slammed my head against the refrigerator so violently hard that my head shattered the shelf, causing everything to come tumbling out of the fridge, including a large glass jug of milk, which shattered, broke and split, leaving shards of spiky glass everywhere, and a pool of milk spilt on the floor. Mr. Richards began punching me very hard, and it was exceedingly painful. "Look what you've done, boy," he shrieked. "You are going to have to clean up all this mess you've made. Look what you've done, you stupid, stupid boy." By this time I was so aggrieved by being attacked, and the punches were brutally hard, that I began to fight back. I reached for the heavy glass vase on the kitchen table for self-defence, and thrust it on the side of Mr. Richards' head very, very hard. And the flowers and water scattered everywhere, and some broken flower heads literally floated upon the spilt milk. I punched Mr. Richards again, very hard, and then he fell backwards, slipping and skidding on the milk, where a large piece of glass cut through the scalp of his head. although to be fair it was my hefty blows that had rendered him unconscious. I remember the blood from the open cut was mingling with all the milk, and it looked like Mr. Richards was lying in a sea of strawberry milk. Mrs. Richards, who had been watching the whole scene unfold, began to scream, "You've killed my husband, you nasty, nasty boy! I knew we should never have fostered you. I could tell you were bad news from the very start." At that she reached for her husband's hunting rifle and began chasing after me with it. I ran out of the house as quickly as I could. "Get here, boy!" she shrieked. "I'm going to blow that head of yours right off and leave you in the streets for the dogs to eat up." With all the commotion going on in the house, the other children promptly woke up, and they were clad in their pyjamas and dressing gowns and were begging their mother to calm down, because they assured her that their dad was fine, but just unconscious. "Don't do something stupid, mother," one of the kids cried out. "You know you tend to overreact, and you don't know how to use Dad's hunting rifle anyway. Please stop." "I'll do what I bloody like," Mrs. Richards shouted, "and we'll bury that brat under the porch when I'm done with him." "She said that?" gasped my grandmother, looking appalled. "You better believe she said that," sighed Michael. I sprinted out of that house as fast as I possibly could, while Mrs. Richards fired after me, the bullets missing me sometimes by a fraction of an inch. It was a miracle I didn't get hit, but maybe it was because she was a bad shot. I knew if she could have killed me successfully, she most certainly would have done so, for her determination to kill me was unquestionable. But kudos to all her kids. They were doing their level best to stop her, as they could clearly see she was unhinged and very much overreacting to everything. "You are lucky you weren't killed, boy," said my grandmother, grabbing Michael's hands and squeezing it tightly. "What did you do next?" "Well, I just ran, walked for many miles at a hurried pace, and hitchhiked along the way. And I was picked up by some good people, who luckily didn't ask me too many awkward questions. Eventually I came to a more remote, very rocky wooded area, which was close to where you live. I remember darkness swept over that valley so fast, and I could hear the sound of coyotes in the distance, which made me feel very vulnerable and exposed, as I knew I was a sitting duck for a hungry predator, and that did trouble me quite a bit. I tried to hide in some dense undergrowth, and I carried a large stick in my hands for self-defence, in the event that I should need to defend myself from a rampaging wild animal. "You poor thing," said my grandmother, wiping away a tear that had appeared in the corner of her eye. "You must have felt very afraid all on your own." "Oh, believe me, I was terrified. I was begging for the night to be over before it even begun, but I was glad not to be at the Richards' house any more. All of a sudden something began throwing acorns at me, and that was when I saw the wild woman, and she was just standing there looking at me." "Wild woman?" asked my grandmother, looking perplexed. "What's a wild woman? Are you talking about a homeless woman living in the woods?" "Well, she was like a human in many aspects, I suppose, but there was an ape-like influence to her appearance, and she was obviously female because of her small pert breasts. She was much bigger, wider, muscular and taller than a human being, of course, though with a funny arch-shaped head and very long arms, with powerful strong legs. She was covered with dark brown hair that was longer and more straggly than a bear's, and her face was quite feminine, but her leathery grey skin was rather weathered, and her forehead very wrinkled. She possessed a wide flat nose, deep-set dark coffee-coloured eyes, and a very slender mouth. "I've never heard of such an anomalous creature before," said my grandmother, looking rather surprised. "He's telling the truth, Grandma," I piped. "I witnessed a very strange creature like that carrying Michael to this farmhouse during the storm, but I couldn't see it clearly, as it was raining very hard. But his description of the creature fits the hazy impression of what I believe I discerned." "I did not doubt Michael for a moment," said my grandmother, coaxing Michael to go on with his story. "Well, this big hairy critter indicated for me to follow her, and although she was exceedingly intimidating, I knew instinctively that she meant me no harm and was trying to help me, and so I followed her. She pointed to this narrow opening in a rocky outcrop, which I managed to squeeze through, and it opened up into a nice little shelter where I could sleep, and the critter kindly brought me a couple of deer pelts to lie on and an old ice cream container filled with berries and apples. She then placed some thorny briars outside the narrow opening to protect me from coyotes, which she removed every morning and replaced at night. So this kind creature took care of me and brought me food, including meat, which I ate raw because I needed the protein. She was very good to me. I can see she was kind to you, said my grandmother, but why did the creature bring you to our farmhouse? I don't understand that. She's been trying to bring me here for days, said Michael. She kept pointing to your house through the trees and indicating that I should come up here. I think she could see that I was not cut out for roughing it in the woods and should be with other humans like myself. I didn't want to be around any humans, as I've kind of lost faith in people. I've had so many bad experiences with foster homes of late, especially with the Richards. Of course you have, dear, said my grandmother, because you haven't lived anywhere where you've truly been loved and appreciated. But you mustn't tarnish all people with the same brush, as we're not all as loathsome as those Richards are. Anyway, finish your story, because I sense it's not quite over yet. Well, said Michael, I've always been terrified of storms, and for some reason that female creature sensed my obvious distress, as I was cowering in terror every time I heard the thunder break through the sky. The critter pointed to your house, and then decisively tossed me over her back, even though I did protest a little, and then she opened your kitchen door and popped me on the floor just like that, and well, here I am now. Well, she obviously knew you needed help, said my grandmother. You were too obstinate to reach out for it, so she gave you that much-needed quintessential push and took the decision out of your hands. She strikes me as a very intelligent, discerning creature, and good for her, that's what I say, because she brought you to the right house, because I have decided that I'm going to adopt you as my very own son. Really, said Michael, looking astounded, but you don't even know me. What if you change your mind like the other couple did? You might decide you don't like me after all. I've decided that I do like you very much indeed, said my grandmother, and I never change my mind. Ask Howard about that. I'm as stubborn as an ox, with Taurus as my star sign, and I'm set in my ways, and when I make my mind up about anything, I refuse to be budged. It's true, I said. If she wants to adopt you, wild horses will not stop her, and you'll be happy because my grandmother is the best mother you could ever have. So I guess that makes you inadvertently my brother, in a manner of speaking. Tears rolled down Michael's face, and he began to cry. I'm sorry, I don't mean to blub like a baby, but you have no idea how happy you have both just made me. I truly believed I would never ever have a real home or family. And so it was. Before long I was living in my grandmother's house with a brand new brother called Michael, and the two of us became incredibly close. My grandmother showered him with love that had been so absent from his life for so long, and I could see that Michael blossomed in response to that love, like a withered flower being watered and coming back to life. He knew now that he had found a place that he could truly call his home. When my parents returned from their long trip abroad, they were surprised to see that there was another addition to our extended family, and they welcomed him with much love as my brother. My mother promptly announced that she was also pregnant, with baby number 3 on the way, so it was an exciting time for all of us, and the only thing missing from our lives was my grandfather, who had died several years back from a bad bout of pneumonia, and he was sorely missed by the all of us. One day during early spring in the March of 1964, Michael and I ambled along the verdant, undulating countryside, through the flowery meadow towards the woods, and it was an exquisitely beautiful day, as the sun was shining, casting its radiant heat upon our skins. After the cold, biting chill of the long-drawn-out winter that was thankfully now behind us, we were more than a little eager to appreciate the magnificence of this glorious spring day that elevated our mood and lifted our spirits immeasurably. The eastern budwood trees were blossoming with purple blooms, along with the show-stopping display of the saucer magnolias and the pretty pink blooms of the dogwood and crabapple trees, while the white oak trees were covered in hundreds of perfectly new green leaves, and everything was so fresh, crisp and bright. As we set forth into the heart of the woods, we discerned that the ground was covered in pretty bloodroot, along with the loveliest vibrant displays of Virginian bluebells and sumptuous mosses were swathed over large boulders and tree trunks in a resplendent curtain of emerald green carpets. I could feel a joyful skip in my step as we climbed up a rugged elevation where the hiking trails were bordered by rocky boulders until the ground became less steep and the whole wood green flattened out. We could see a little squirrel celebrating the spring day with us, and was glad that its long days of hibernation were long behind him. He eyed us curiously with his bright brown eyes, positioning his body on a branch, where the warm sun danced through the leaves and dappled his luxurious red coat with a snug warmth. It seemed even the animals were basking in the sunshine this morning. Michael and I came upon a very large oak tree, and we began to engrave our names and dates on the tree trunk. I carved my name, Howard Posner, 19th of March, 1963, and Michael began to put his name in the trunk next to mine. Michael Posner, he wrote, and we both grinned, and then I began to carve the words, Brothers Forever. All of a sudden, everything in the woods became very still, and the bird song receded, and the squirrel we had been watching sunning itself had mysteriously vanished and disappeared from sight. I felt certain that something was watching us, and it sent an ominous chill down my spine. And that was when we saw her. It was a very surly-looking, well-rounded woman, with a face that was so enraged, and her messy hair was dishevelled as if she had been challenged with her comb in the morning. The scariest part of all was that in her weathered, sun-damaged hands she was carrying a hunting rifle, and pointing it directly at Michael. I realised immediately that this was Michael's most recent foster mother, Mrs. Richards, and she looked like she was furious. Mrs. Richards, said Michael, trembling with fear. What are you doing here? How did you manage to find me? You thought I wasn't going to find you, sonny boy. Is that right? She smirked. We took you into our home with the goodness of our hearts, and how did you repay us for our kindness? You only went and throttled my husband with a vase to the side of his head. You're not going to get away with what you've done, you nasty little piece of work. You thought I forgot what you've done, sonny boy, didn't you? I never ever forget. I have a memory on me like an elephant. Mrs. Richards, your husband was beating me up, said Michael. He was always beating me up, for no reason at all. And for once in my life I fought back. It was self-defence, that's what it was. Self-defence? Is that what they call it now? You could have killed him, boy. That was one hell of a blow you gave to his head, along with using my expensive crystal vase that you broke into hundreds of pieces. I'm sorry, Mrs. Richards, but your husband was hurting me. He was really hurting me. I had to fight back, and I'm sorry that I knocked him out. I really am, but he was asking for it. Do you have any idea what permanent damage you've done to my husband? Said Mrs. Richards. My husband now gets epileptic seizures because of you. You're not going to get away with this. Excuse me, Mrs. Richards, I said, interceding. I know all about you, and from what I've learnt about you, you and your husband are atrocious, deplorable people. It was despicable the way that you treated Michael. And you call yourself Christians. You kind of people disgust me. You should be heartily ashamed of your behaviour, for you're anything but people of God. At that prompt explosion of truth on my part, that frankly needed telling, the piqued, affronted Mrs. Richards became red in the face. How dare you speak to me like that, she said, eyeing me with an acrimonious, disgruntled look on her face. You boys are cut from the same cloth, I can tell. No one will miss you if I blow the heads off both of you right now. Move over there now, to those trees, she said, pointing with her rifle at both of us, and we obediently obliged. She fired a couple of warning bullets into the air that showed us she meant business. I realised in that moment that this psychotic, sectionable woman was seriously deranged. She was unbalanced, mentally unstable, and downright insane. I knew that she was more than capable of blowing our heads off, as she had not come all this way for a nice little chat, and that was very clear. Don't hurt Howard, protested Michael. You can blow my head off, Mrs. Richards, if you like, but don't touch my brother. He's done nothing wrong. This is not his fault." "Your brother? Is that what you call him?" mocked Mrs. Richards scathingly. "I see you're playing happy families together. How nice! How absolutely pathetic! You two boys are as bad as each other. I've no intention of leaving any witnesses behind me," she said. "I wasn't born yesterday, and I'm not stupid either. Once we've buried the both of you, the authorities will assume that you've just run away, and you'll be a missing persons case, and that will be that." In that moment I've never felt more afraid, because Mrs. Richards was as tough as old boots, and as mad as a March hare. In that moment, wrought with incredible tension, I wondered if I should risk tackling Mrs. Richards by pouncing on her unexpectedly, fighting her and trying to retrieve the rifle from her. It might be worth the risk, especially if we were already dead, so to speak. I was trying to think quickly on my feet about tactics and manoeuvres, and about my next move, when all of a sudden, bolting through the brush like a rhino in full charge, was a large humanoid creature covered in hair. I knew at once that this was the female creature that had rescued Michael from that storm and protected him for 2 long weeks in the forest. She appeared to be helping us again, instinctively sensing that we were in perilous danger and that the batty Mrs. Richards was our greatest threat. The creature lunged towards Mrs. Richards, who began to scream at the top of her lungs, "Help! Help! Please help me! Help me! Someone help!" I will admit that this formidable, daunting creature looked so terrifying and scary, like the monster that your darkest nightmares are composed of, and her imposing height and strength intimidated Mrs. Richards, whose eyes became as wide as saucers, and her body was trembling like a blancmange jelly, and shaking with terror. The female creature grabbed the rifle and tossed it to Michael, who picked it up with a look of relief growing on his face. The creature curled back her lips to expose her glistening large white teeth and began to growl directly at Mrs. Richards, and it was the most horrifying sight to behold, because those growls were equally as fierce and as menacing as that of a lion. "You better run, Mrs. Richards," said Michael. "This is my friend, and she will hurt you if you ever come back here again." Mrs. Richards did try to run, but she couldn't move, as so great and dreadful was her fear, that her body just froze up solid like a block of ice, and she seemed incapable of moving a single muscle. The hairy humanoid was more than willing to help her, for she grabbed the woman in her arms, tossing her up in the air as if she was a bouncy ball, and the woman was screaming in terror, "Put me down! Put me down! Put me down!" The creature slung the woman over her back like a large sack of potatoes and glided towards the road that was situated on the edge of the forest, where I imagine her car was probably parked. We could hear Mrs. Richards' screams becoming fainter and fainter as the creature carried her away, and then shortly afterwards we did hear the sound of a car engine starting up and driving away. Mrs. Richards had gone, and we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we would never see her again. We saw the creature gliding towards us after she had dumped Mrs. Richards off at what I assume must have been her car. She acknowledged us through her congenial warm brown eyes, and Michael, with salty tears pouring down his face, ran up to her unhesitantly and embraced the creature in his arms with an affectionate hug, although his arms could not encircle her because she was so wide. I could see the creature genuinely loved Michael like a son, for she patted his back affectionately and looked on him with eyes that were filled with such unconditional love. And I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this creature would always have our backs. In the years that passed, we occasionally saw her, and she would make herself known to us and then glide away, and she was beautiful and magnificent in my eyes. I know now, all these years later, that she was definitely a Bigfoot, and Michael and I, who are now both grandparents by now, look back on those times with nostalgic, happy memories, and we have nothing but good things to say about the anomalous creature that we call Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.